Good afternoon, everyone. It is 2 p.m. Thank you for joining us for our webinar on traffic safety and law enforcement from both a traditional law enforcement and alcohol law enforcement perspective. My name is Kelly Roberson, and I'm the Executive Director of the Center for Alcohol Policy. For those of you who aren't familiar with the center, our primary mission is education. Education of regulators, legislators, and the public about alcohol, both its uniqueness and its regulation. And one of the ways in which we accomplish this mission is by hosting webinars such as this one. This is a follow-on to another webinar we hosted last month on alcohol consumption and traffic safety. If you weren't able to join for that, I will drop a link into the chat here and would encourage you to go back and watch it. There's a lot of great information shared there. We have a fantastic group of experts assembled today, and after the conversation, I'll pop back in with 3 key takeaways and close us out. Without any more housekeeping, I'll introduce our moderator for today's discussion. JT Griffin has over 20 years of Capitol Hill and government relations experience. For 8 years, he worked on Capitol Hill for a senior member of the House Appropriations Committee. For over 13 years, he ran the Government Relations and Communications Department at Mothers Against Drunk Driving. While there, he helped pass laws in over 35 states to improve drunk driving laws and helped advance legislation to support drunk driving vehicle technologies. In the fall of 2020, JT formed Griffin Strategies LLC, which is a full-service government relations firm that represents clients before the federal government, including the U.S. House of Representatives, the U.S. Senate, and various federal agencies. The firm also specializes in issues relating to transportation and technology, the federal appropriations process, and advising nonprofit organizations on fundraising and best practice management. JT, pulling from your Capitol Hill experience, I guess I should say the gentleman from Virginia is recognized.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. I appreciate that kind introduction, and I appreciate everybody joining us today to learn more about law enforcement. I really appreciate the center for the opportunity to partner with you again this year. As Kelly mentioned, we hosted together a webinar on traffic safety earlier this year, which I would definitely recommend if you haven't had a chance to view. I know Kelly is going to share that at some point during today's webinar. I definitely recommend that you take time to watch that. And today's panel really formed out of a couple things. Last year, I worked with the center to put together 2 different reports. One was on the history of drunk driving laws, and one was on open container laws. And one of the themes that kept popping up in both of those reports was the issue of law enforcement and the challenges and the issues that were facing law enforcement over the last few years, both right before the pandemic and then during the pandemic. And that led us to sort of where we are today, which is this webinar. I wanted to just sort of kick off with one of the statistics that was included in the report on the history of DUI, and I think it's sort of a good way to get this conversation started today. There was a recent survey by the Police Executive Research Forum, which showed that police retirements are up 45%. There's been an 18% increase in resignations and a 5% decrease in the hiring rate. And funny enough, as I was putting together some thoughts for today, if anyone reads Axios, in their PM, it was either yesterday or the day before, they quoted these same statistics and shared some of the same issues. So I would definitely call your attention to that article if you haven't seen it, because I think it talks a lot about what we're going to talk about today. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our panel. We have a great panel here today to talk about the challenges, not only with sort of traditional law enforcement, but also with law enforcement as it pertains to alcohol sales and regulations. So just kind of going around the Zoom here, starting with Jerry Oliver. So Jerry has served as the Assistant Chief of Police in Phoenix, Arizona, the Director of Drug Policy in Memphis, Tennessee, the Chief of Police in Pasadena, California, in Richmond, Virginia, and in Detroit, Michigan. So really no one better in law enforcement than Jerry. And Jerry also serves on the Center's Advisory Committee. So really appreciate having Jerry here to get his perspective. And next would be Mike Brown, and Chief Mike Brown, who has been I'm proud to call a friend for a long time now. Mike Mike most recently served as the Chief of Police in Alexandria, Virginia. And before that was a longtime staff member over at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration. And then before that was the commissioner of the California Highway Patrol. So Mike has a really long history in law enforcement, really knows ins and outs of that well, and I think is going to really give us some interesting and some thoughtful takeaways. And then after that, we're going to hear from Matt Botting. Matthew was appointed to the position of ABC General Counsel in California in August of 2008. And he's going to talk to us about what's happening in California and what his experience has been. And then finally, last but not least, is my friend Dottie Taylor. And Dottie has served in many capacities throughout her career. And she right now is at the helm of the Missouri Alcohol, Tobacco and Control as the director. So Dottie definitely brings a unique perspective to this conversation as well. So with that, I'm going to turn it over and let Jerry just kind of give us some of his thoughts on what's happening in law enforcement right now. Jerry.
JT, thank you. Good morning, everybody. I guess it's afternoon back there. It's your morning for those of us out on the West Coast. Let me just introduce myself basically, first of all, as one of the advisors at the Center for Alcohol Policy, and just add a little bit to what Kelly said earlier about what we do at the center, because that's where I'm sort of stationed right now. As one of 5 advisors to the Center for Alcohol Policy, my role is to help educate the media, policymakers, state regulators, educators, and the public about the proper regulation of alcohol, the safe and responsible consumption of alcohol, underage drinking, drunk driving, and the effects of alcohol consumption on public health and safety. We work closely with industry, as Kelly said, and public health partners to affirm the values of state-based alcohol that was called for in the 21st century. As many of you know, there are forces out there today that are attempting to unwind decades of precedent, including the 3-tier system. The center calls attention to that and illegal access to alcohol by persons under 21 years of age for both commercial and non-commercial sources. This is an interest that we have an interest in maintaining industry integrity as important as orderly marketplaces while furthering effective state tax collection. That's my position there at the center. I've been there for a while, and it's been what a great opportunity working with Kelly and some of the projects that we've had, initiatives that we've had there at the center. I'll stop there and come back just a little later to talk when I change hats and speak as a liquor license and liquor law enforcement agent that I spent some time in the state of Arizona as well. So, JT, with that, I'll stop.
Well, thank you so much, Jerry. So next we'll go to Mike Brown. So Mike, if you could tell us a little bit about sort of what you're seeing, from a law enforcement perspective. You have just a great sort of career where you've been able to work, running a state organization with at the federal level, and then also at the local level in Alexandria. So tell us a little bit about what's happening out there right now.
Well, JT, first of all, thank you for inviting me to this party. And this is a very timely issue in the law enforcement community. Many of us realize and have read about various issues regarding staffing and policing and the impact that the last couple of years has had on policing. The PERF study that you mentioned earlier, those numbers that you have, if you dive deeper into them, you find out that many of those retirements are early retirements. There are people who came on at the mid or latter half of the 1984 crime bill era, where we were hiring 100,000 plus new police officers. They're retiring early. And the one that's most troubling in the law enforcement community is the resignations. And many of these are young people who have just been invested in the policing, police departments have invested in for a long-term career. The difficulty it's presenting on law enforcement on a general rule, whether it's especially at the state and local level, is it takes a while to replace those folks. You just can't hire somebody and like put them behind a counter and say, okay, be a cop. They have to go through a rigorous selection process, including a background. They have to go through training. And it takes a while before they feel comfortable in that, in the shoes of being a police officer. In addition to that, this staffing shortage that is across the board pretty significant for most agencies, especially the large agencies and many of the inner cities, has created issues that they've had to deal with on an operational basis. They're in the process of reprioritizing some of their work. In some communities, they're not responding to anything but a hot call or a dangerous crime. They've reprioritized not taking crashes involving, traffic collisions. Domestic calls are being reassigned to telephonic representation. Those are the kinds of things that they're having to do because they just don't have enough cops. And so what's interesting is no one knows where the administration of alcohol regulations fits into that, because that really hasn't been specifically addressed, and I'm guessing it probably varies across the country. And there's no real survey as to nationally to see exactly how this reprioritization is occurring. The other piece that I think that is interesting is the broad sense of mental health. One of the things that came out of a study by Longman Coper in 2021 was to look at the impact of what's happening in law enforcement assignments. And mental health played a big role in a lot of different areas. And clearly, it also plays a role in the use of alcohol, because in many cases, alcohol is a self-medication tool for people that are involved in mental health. So we really don't know the scope of the problem. The last thing that I would want to comment on briefly on a national level, in many communities and in several states, there has been a statutorial change on terms of what they want the law enforcement community to do. Washington, where I'm living now, and Virginia, where I used to live, have such laws, where they have actually, by statute, reprioritized what they want police officers to do to engage the public or to initiate activity for criminal enforcement or investigation. And those are the kinds of things that I think affect the overall morale of law enforcement. And quite frankly, I think it's represented in the resignations and the retirements. It's also represented in the recruiting. If you are in the business and you look at the recruiting incentives that are being offered and the retention incentives that are being offered in law enforcement right now, they're staggering. $25,000 in some police departments or more, just to come on to become a cop. Back in my day, there was 1,500 people competing for 2 positions. Not so anymore. And that affects, I think, the morale of the existing officers, and it represents that. And it also represents what we need to do to kind of turn that around to get good people doing this job. So it has implications. We can get into more detail, but that is what we're seeing. I've seen it as part of my work with the National Policing Institute. I've seen it in the trades every day. And there's a lot of work to be done in order to restore law enforcement to where it was, 3 or 4 years ago, to be able to deal with the issue of administration of alcohol regulations.
Well, thanks, Mike. And I know that, one of the statistics that I keep seeing is that, and especially with my background, having worked at MAD for so long, you see the drunk driving arrests that have really gone down. So I think that's really an issue that, you can't really talk about traffic safety right now without talking about law enforcement and looking at, what we need to do to reverse some of those numbers. So I think we'll talk about that a little bit more as well. Next, I wanted to turn it over to Matt. So Matt, you have been dealing with some unique issues in California, but maybe not quite as unique as we all might think. But you have a program in California where you've been doing some innovative things in response to alcohol to go laws, which I think have created some new challenges in California. So I thought maybe you could tell us a little bit about, what your program is, and then how you've responded, and what's been going on with these new laws that were really passed as I think as a response to the pandemic. But we've seen, in many cases, they were alcohol to go and drinks to go were really passed as a, kind of a short-term solution with regard to the pandemic. But we've seen these laws really pass and become permanent in many locations across the country. So, kind of tell us a little bit about what's happening in California and what your experience is.
Yeah, thanks, JT. I appreciate the invitation to speak today. It's I'm the lawyer on the panel, and so I'm the only one who doesn't have a law enforcement background. And first of all, let me just say, I appreciate all the work you guys do. And I also, being a lawyer, need to start off with a bit of a disclaimer, because I tend to be somewhat outspoken and a little blunt at times. And so what I may say today is merely my opinions, and do not necessarily reflect the policies of the Alcoholic Beverage Control in California or the administration. So with that behind me, yeah, touching directly on the question you posed about the cocktails to go and so forth, and some of the things that we saw happening. I mean, you're absolutely right. The pandemic, it hit us all out of the blue, and so we had to pivot very quickly to help businesses really stay in business to the best they could when everything was being shut down. So one of those things was, or really two of them were, expansion of delivery of alcohol, and most particularly and most controversially perhaps was the cocktails to go, which is essentially allowing restaurants to deliver the drinks that they would normally serve on their premises away from their premises. And so, we didn't do anything particularly outrageous, other than tell everyone that we just weren't going to be enforcing the laws as written. And so that certainly did lead to a lot more delivery than I think anyone was expecting of alcohol. But in some respects, it was licensees exercising privileges they already had, just didn't know it. But certainly expanding, and especially in that cocktails to go. And what really kind of hit us was when we got a call from, I think it was the Washington Post, inquiring about things they had heard, that reporter had heard about kids getting handed drinks by delivery drivers. And this was happening all over the place. So we did very quickly look into that by running some operations, undercover minor decoy operations, and ordering alcohol and seeing if it would be delivered. And unfortunately, the results just blew everyone away. It was close to like an 80% failure rate. And so we recognized very quickly that we had a big problem with this expansion of alcohol being delivered away from premises. And so we started some outreach initially, talking to the major companies involved in deliveries, and they were very responsive. Certainly, they didn't want to have kids getting hold of alcohol, for sure. But we did run some other sort of test operations, and while the percentages did come down a little bit, they were still in the 40, 50, 60% failure range. And so one of the first things we did at that juncture was actually adopt an emergency regulation that set parameters around the use of decoys in delivery operations, because our existing regulation at the time would have precluded the use of decoys, we felt, in delivery operations, because you got to lie to get about your age to get the order. So that was the biggest problem. So once we got that emergency regulation adopted, we started then doing actual enforcement operations, and again and continued our engagement actually with the delivery companies, and we did see the failure rates coming down. But still in a very high range. And one of the challenges has been that, look, we're an administrative agency. We regulate against the licensees, and licensees are being held responsible for deliveries by, the Grubhubs and Uber Eats and so on and so forth out there. And so it wasn't really putting the responsibility where it really lay. And so, fast forward to today, we are still running those operations. We're still seeing failure rates, but more in the realm of what we would see in traditional brick and mortar operations. So that's, not great, but more in the 15 to 20% range, although we did see a spike recently up around 30%. So it's still an ongoing issue. And there is some legislation currently pending in California that would actually, if it is enacted in its current form, would require these delivery companies to be permitted by ABC. So therefore they would have some direct skin in the game and responsibility for illegal deliveries. And there's a lot to that. It's a bit of a moving target. It does a lot of things, including actually expanding even further the cocktails to go and enshrining that more as a permanent fixture in California rather than a temporary measure. And I know some people will point to the fact that it has a sunset provision in it, which means unless it's reenacted by the legislature or that sunset is removed, it'll automatically be repealed one day. But in the alcohol world, the reality is you very, very rarely see a sunset provision actually go into effect. So I think reality being what it is, absent something really, really bad happening, we're probably going to be seeing these things become permanent long term.
Well, thanks, Matt. I think that's a really interesting perspective and sort of a really good case study for states that either have passed laws like this or considering. And I think we can talk more about your thoughts on that in just a minute too. And next, I wanted to let Dottie give us her thoughts on what's happening in Missouri. I know there's lots going on there with budget issues, with staffing issues. And so just wanted to give you an opportunity to tell us a little bit about what's happening in your state.
Thank you so much. And first of all, I'm just honored to be invited. Thank you to Cap and to Kelly and JT for even thinking of Missouri as far as this is concerned. Yeah, I don't think we're unique. I know we're not unique as far as staffing is across the country. I know that for sure. But perhaps I can give you just a little bit of background. First of all, I've been at Alcohol and Tobacco Control here in Missouri since 2017. But prior to that, I retired as a Missouri State Trooper. So, there's a unique. Then it was the same thing that, I think that Michael mentioned is, you were competing, you were getting how many applications to fill just a few positions. It was amazing how that happened. And so across now, obviously we've all been feeling that. I will say that our staff at Alcohol and Tobacco Control here in Missouri have had a challenge, a big challenge. So to give you a little history, back in 2002, we had 84 full-time employees. And 55 of those were our enforcement agents, and we had seven district offices across the state. I think our budget was $4.1 million at that point. So moved forward, there were some really rough years. Legislature decided that we didn't need all of that staff and we didn't need all of that money. And so in 2016, we had 19 full-time employees. That was 5 agents. And they were also, and our agents, we have a unique position here is that our agents not only do enforcement, but they have a part in our licensing. So, and we were down to 1 district, and that was in 2016. Our budget was $1.2 million at that point. Fortunately, the industry saw that this probably did not, this was not a good thing that we had been cut so badly. So they were instrumental in getting the agency back up and running. They got us a dedicated fund, which was very, very helpful to us instead of competing for general revenue. And so when I came on in 17, we had 29 FTE. So we were our full-time employees. So we were moving back up. Our budget was a little further. What we have today is we have 40 full-time employees. That's it. That's still, I believe, a pretty small amount. The 15 of those are agents, and they cover our entire state. And then we have some district supervisors, and we have 4 district offices now. Just a shameless plug for the agency because they do so much work. I think I mentioned to you, first of all, our budget was 4.1 million in 2002. It's only 4.5 as a proposal for this next fiscal year. So yeah, at least we've made it back to that point. But specifically, just FYI of how much you can do with not a whole lot of people. Last year we collected $53.5 million for the state of Missouri. Our agency alone. We approved 22,000 some odd brand label and applications. We processed over 26,000 licenses. So you can do a lot, but we have been asking for more, like everyone else. Currently, our agent to licensee ratio is 1 agent for 1,000 licensees. So we are purely proactive. It's really difficult for us. And just as a real quick there, what Matt was talking about the to-go, we got that legislation as well, and it's permanent now. And we asked for a few more folks, and we got the responsibility, but we didn't get the staff to try to, because we have a lot of issues to manage, right? So we are reactive to complaints and inspections. What I'm going to mention just off the top 2 is, and I think all law enforcement, not just in the alcohol realm is, but we're also seeing, which has been the trend nationally, is a lot more confrontational, whether we are dealing with minors. We're finding it when we're dealing with licensees, employees, and some of our licensees. I mean, it just the other night, they went in for an inspection because their license was expired, and we wanted to make sure that they, weren't selling and didn't have any on display. And one of the individuals that was working there literally tried to get in a physical confrontation with our agent. To add that to that, and I hope I'm speaking across that a lot of states are dealing with the same thing, but across that same piece of that is all of our agents are Class A certified, post certified, so they are full law enforcement. But our agents in our agency, they are only authorized for alcohol and tobacco under that. So there's so many things that on enforcement capacity that kind of holds them back, and that we have to really, really rely on other law enforcement agencies to assist us in that kind of thing. So, and again, we're finding the same issues trying to hire, and trying to pull folks in and trying to work on what are some things that we can highlight that will, get these people to come in for a job and to stay with us too, not only to recruit, but retain.
Well, I thank you, Dottie. I think that's really interesting. I think, definitely getting that case study of what's happening in Missouri, and I think budgets are obviously one of the big issues that we're all struggling with at the state, local level. So I guess the first question I would ask to the group is, what do we need to do as a country? What do we need to do to fix some of these issues in policing, and what are some of the things that we need to do to make sure that law enforcement really has the tools and the resources that it needs in order to keep us safe and to help enforce the laws that we have? And so I guess maybe what I'll do is I'm kind of looking at Mike right now on my Zoom screen. So maybe I'll start with Mike and then go to Jerry and Dottie and Matt.
Thanks, JT. That's a tough question, and that is the big question. I don't know if there's a magic fix. We have to kind of personally address the issue of how we feel about law enforcement as a nation, and support them to begin with. That helps in a lot of different areas. The illustration that Dottie provided about the funding, that's an issue in many jurisdictions. There was a reaction in 2020 following the killing of George Floyd, politically, where a lot of agencies were defunded, or let's say their budget was reduced. The fact of the matter is, some of that's been restored, much of it hasn't. And a lot of what people don't realize is that when you reduce the size of a law enforcement agency, the vast majority of what you're doing is taking away the people. It's not a lot. The overhead is minimal compared to the personnel costs. And again, replacing those folks is very difficult to do. The other thing is there's a lot of discussion about how policing is going to be reimagining down the road. And that's across the board, whether it's a specialized law enforcement or whether it's going to be the general law enforcement at the state and local level. And there's no, shall we say, design or vision, I think, that is wholly accepted by all the communities. And maybe it isn't going to be accepted by the communities as a general sense nationally, but people are going through those discussions at the local levels. I was speaking with some folks from Portland about 2 months ago, police officers and management there, and they're really struggling with that in that community. And you can imagine the discussion that we hear on the national rhetoric is, and the national reporting on Portland is just the tip of the iceberg with what they're dealing with internally. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to restore, and we're going to have to do it quickly, because you have to be able to design what you expect of your law enforcement in a community or in a function, and then support it. And that's going to take some political courage, in my estimation, in this day and age. And I'm not seeing it completely across the board on a national level, to be brutally frank.
Well, Jerry, what are your thoughts on that?
I want to piggyback just a little bit on what Michael just said. And as a former regulator myself, I really want to make 2 points. Let me just make these 2 points. First of all, law enforcement generally, but liquor law enforcement especially, seems too often to be left out of the loop when decisions are made, or when priorities are set. When we're discussing curbing abuse and generating revenue, that full balance. For example, in states or jurisdictions where a decision is made, this is just an example, to extend bar times to 4 a.m. in the morning for business reasons, along with what Matt talked about, and just kind of helping to save some of the businesses. No one consulted with law enforcement, and wreaked havoc on local police agencies and liquor law enforcement trying to ensure public safety and public health in matters that need to be adequately addressed. I mean, with the expansion of so many different innovations, like having liquor available on sidewalks and having liquor available in parking lots, that made it extremely difficult to prevent juveniles from getting liquor at any time of the day or night that it was being served. So law enforcement generally needs to be more in the mix, more in the conversation when it comes to that kind of thing. And my second point goes along with what my fellow panelists talked about, is that alcohol regulation or regulatory and enforcement agencies are, one, overtasked, over-assigned, under-resourced, and especially now in the post-pandemic era where missions have been expanded by jurisdiction level business-friendly legislation or by executive orders, like what happened here in Arizona. Adding to the list of their responsibilities means that the traditional, in my view, the traditional regulation and alcohol-related laws are either unenforced, under-enforced, or totally ignored. So in my home state, Dottie, like what you talked about, we have 10 investigators here in Arizona that are responsible for 15,000 licensees scattered over 114,000 square miles in 15 counties in the state of Arizona, one of the largest states in the country. Traditional enforcement priorities are being waylaid, things like combating underage drinking, addressing over-servicing issues that is providing information or training to help outlet managers and staff comply with over-service laws by learning how to better recognize intoxicated customers and by providing strategies to prevent excessive consumption that in many cases associated with DUI trace follow-up investigative efforts that we're really in the state of Arizona having trouble devoting the time to do the trace that will yield the DUI information that we really need for planning. Or for that matter, even training the officers themselves. Also complicating liquor law enforcement is the loss in many cases of the local police department counterparts that Michael talked about. Liquor law enforcement depends heavily on local law enforcement, being the eyes and ears in many cases, and many of the initiatives or the efforts, they are the foot soldiers to get many of those things done. And over time, we've lost those liaisons because vacancies or resignations or retirement that supported many of my efforts. So those are the really big observations that I've been able to make in talking to some of the liquor law enforcement people that I associate with. And I think the fixes really are more political than anything else. The recognition also by the industry that the resources needed to do an adequate job of regulation really is in their court in many cases to advocate on behalf of liquor law enforcement.
I think that's really thoughtful. Appreciate that, Jerry. Thank you. Dottie, I want to give you a chance to respond too.
Yeah, I agree with all of it. I think it definitely is a spider web. As I was listening, I'm like, okay, we have 3 R's, right? We have restore. I added 1 R, but I think we're all saying that, and I mentioned it, respect. Again, that has been lost a lot of, in perhaps both ways, but and also then, and Jerry said, resources, right? So in what, I think combining forces. So on our end for Missouri, we are very strongly, our message is we partner with our industry folks. We partner with our licensees. We want them to be successful. That's what we're here for. And so we offer education and training programs and things like that, so that we don't have to immediately, find out what they're doing wrong, but let's show them what to do right. And so we already do that. Jerry, I can't even compare to Arizona, so I'm not even going to try, but I thought our story was sad. I'm so sorry. But the reality is, if we don't have the staff that can get out and do that training, that can make those connections with our licensees. I mean, literally, we started a program trying to just get back when we only had 5 agents, nobody was in the field, unless it was mandatory. And so, reestablishing those connections with our licensees. But then I mentioned that, we work a lot with our local law enforcement because we want to, number one, but also and even our prevention groups and our, we've had conversations with MAD and other prevention groups. And I think it's really important that we combine forces. It always reminds me of the railroad, right? What did the farmer do before then? And so that's how big the industry is, and that's how important it is, and what we could do by combining those things and having conversations and saying, what do you really need? What can we do to help? In all matters of that.
I think that's a great point, Dottie. And Mike has raised his hand there. So Mike, I'll let you chime in before we go to Matt. Oh, you're on mute.
Going to not try and do that, but real quickly before we get too far, the contentious piece is incredibly important to understand. There is a dynamic that I think is affecting law enforcement, and that is the feelings within the community and some of the things that they've witnessed, whether it be on TV or through, the various links that are sent throughout the profession. And that's something that reinforces that notion, if you will, that cops aren't respected and what you do isn't respected. And I do agree with Dottie that we have to be able to work collaboratively, and it is in fact a political decision in many cases as to whether or not an agency is in the capacity or is going to be able to do that. The one thing that I think we often forget in this discussion, and it ties to all of it, is that whatever your type of law enforcement you do, in many cases, it's very individual. The individual that's out there has choices to make. That officer or that agent or that detective can steer a case or not take a case or find a different way, or, so long as they don't get a complaint, it goes unnoticed. And when you have an engaged workforce and officers and law enforcement employees who want to do the right thing for the right reasons, you have less opportunity for things to slip through the cracks. Unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that that's taking place. The traffic enforcement is a good example. Traffic enforcement, if you're driving down the road, maybe you didn't see that stop sign violation, so you didn't stop that person. If you saw something at a liquor store, maybe you just gave it a wink, you didn't see it, and you just walked away. And that is a reflection in many cases of how they feel about themselves and how they feel about their career choice. So this whole perception about trying to, reinvigorate law enforcement has to also recognize the individuals. To do so would, I think, create a disservice. And you know what? There's a lot of cops that are hurting out there. And I wish I could, yank on my ear and fix that, but it doesn't work that way. And it's going to take a long time to repair that.
Well, and Mike, that's one thing that frankly, you always taught me about law enforcement when it came to drunk driving is there's a element of discretion to it. And, I know we've seen nationwide over the last 2 years, an increase in drunk driving deaths and injuries. But really over the last 5 years, we've seen a pattern where drunk driving arrests have really fallen off. And I think with the pandemic, for a host of reasons, we've really seen those arrests go down pretty dramatically. In the first draft that I saw for, I guess it would be for 2020, the numbers have really fallen off in terms of DUI arrests. And we know that people aren't drinking and driving less. So I think it's a real concern. And I think what you just pointed out is really important for people to remember.
It is officer discretion, and there's a considerable amount of research in the policing field that goes back 20, 30 years about what motivates officers and what their discretion is. And it boils down to many cases what the minimax theory is. They're going to minimize their exposure and maximize their reward. And if there's going to be an exposure, they're less likely to engage. Simple as that.
Right. So I think that kind of goes back to, we've got to figure out a way to make sure we engage those individual officers. So Matt, I want to give you an opportunity to respond as well, and then we'll skip to the next question. And then while you're getting ready to answer, if folks as participating in the webinar today, if you have questions for the panel, please feel free to post them. I believe in the Q&A section, and I'm happy to ask those questions as we go along. So Matt, what are your thoughts?
Well, not being a cop myself, I'm kind of looking at this from the outside as an observer, but I've jotted down a page of rants that that kind of dovetail with a lot of what's already been said. But I think perspective for me is that all it takes is one incident, one negative incident, and all the good that law enforcement does, day to day, day in, day out, is just flushed down the toilet. And that's the unfortunate reality, and the national narrative seems to glom onto those bad incidents and rehash them ad infinitum and blame the cop, rather than examining, even in a just the slightest degree, the actions of the other party to that incident that might have caused it to exist in the first place, and then to evolve. Now that's not to say that, we all know, I think, just being realistic about it, there are some bad apples out there. And I think it's great that the more light that's shed on that they get weeded out, because they bring everyone else down. But I think all law enforcement seems to get, tarred and feathered with the same brush when those bad actors engage in their conduct. And I think, someone mentioned the defunding police. I think it's good to have the discussions about, police being asked to do more and more with less and less. Good to have the discussion about mental health and law enforcement and training. But when defunding the police came up, I thought that was the most stupid idea that anyone had ever invented. And because it's just logical. You do that, you're going to have less law enforcement. And who takes advantage of that? The bad actors. And I think we're seeing that rebound effect today, finally, even in communities that were like right at the tip of the spear on defunding the police, and actually did it in some respects. And now they're seeing absolute anarchy and chaos. And I'm going to leave it there right now, but I would say that ABC in California, we partner with law enforcement across the state because we couldn't do our job without every other agency, and we really value those partnerships. I do think that there's a constant balancing act between community outreach, engagement, and education with heavy law enforcement, and that's constantly, I think, the seesaw of those two different approaches. You can't have one without the other, but if you go too heavy one way, then there's going to be negative consequences. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thanks, Matt. So we got one question in from Patrick Maroney. Has there been any documented correlation between drinks to go and DUIs? Matt, I might turn to you on that question first, and then to Dottie.
That's a real good question, because I'm not sure that there is, and that's one of the challenges, I think. And again, when we met to talk about putting this panel together, we had a very long conversation about a lot of different things, and we could be going on for hours. And this is one of them, which is really, I think, there's a lack of really engagement and correlation between those things. Policymakers seem to look at things in a bit of a silo, and it's like, oh, this is great for business, and don't really get any great input, and there may not be any empirical data to support it, which is the big challenge. And it's like, oh, if we just expand access to alcohol, businesses are going to make more money. And then, other than people saying, but that could lead to bad things, or it's going to lead to bad things, it's like, well, has it? I mean, does it? Do we know? I don't know. I don't know that anyone's doing any studies on that. And I don't know if anyone's done any, but I certainly haven't seen any particular data other than, hey, if you expand access to alcohol to really what we're seeing, and someone else mentioned, I think Jerry mentioned deregulation. You're seeing that in the courts. You're seeing that in a large respect in the legislatures, where it's like expand access to alcohol, because get it anywhere, anytime, because that's what people want. And I don't think we really have connected all of the dots, through empirical studies.
Dottie, do you have any thoughts on that question? Because that kind of is going to lead into what my next question is.
Well, I would agree. No, that we don't have any statistics. We know those that are especially that are specific to tied to the DWIs, since but what we do know about to go specifically is those that are not following the legislation as it was written are doing so dramatically outside of. They are not even coming close to following some of those safety strategies that were put in place specifically, that would allow that. So, I mean, one of ours is it has to be a meal. Well, we literally had one where we went in and they provided us with a plastic shot glass and it had one pizza roll in it. And that's how they sold it. Packaging is bad. So to speak specifically about specifically that with statistics, we don't have those to tie those in. JT, would this be a good time for me to kind of give an example, my example? Or okay.
Definitely.
So just I can tell you on a case study. And so we do get, we get documentation from the Missouri State Highway Patrol on their DWIs and their alcohol influence reports. But most of those are they're pretty free text. And what we're looking for is there anybody out there that we know that is a licensee, because that's our focus, that is that we're seeing that name come up a lot in these reports. And I mean, I feel like it's been really, really helpful, because then if nothing else, we give them a little more attention, right? We've got some DWI, if they're saying I was drinking at Joe's bar, and we get, several that say that, then we really want to start really paying attention to that. But that's really our only tie to a DWI, unless the agency contacts us and says, okay, they said they got it from, and of course, for us, that we need that quickly, because a lot of that evidence to make, the proof for that is going to be really, really high on a licensee to hold them accountable for that. And so we were looking for that evidence right away. We all know surveillance video doesn't stay around forever and that kind of thing. I do have an example, though, of working with the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and this happened this year. For us, and what I would say for everyone out there, and this is where my comment of work with your partners, work with other agencies. Kudos to the Missouri State Highway Patrol and this particular trooper specifically, ironically, who came through the academy while I was assigned to the academy with the patrol. But so I do remember him coming through as a recruit, but he worked a crash. So let me back up a minute. So let me tell you about a licensee we had. They got a license just a couple months after I came on. We did what I already said we did. We gave them training. We went in. We have a program called Badges in Business. We stand aside next to them. We help them during the checkout. We show them what they get all kinds of violations there where minors are coming up and trying to buy. And so there's no fault to the licensee, but we're training them. It's on the job. We offer server training. We do all of those things. So we do a lot of that prevention. So with this particular licensee, we did all that. It didn't work. They kept selling to minors, most of the time never checking an ID. During a 3-year period at that location, we cited 79 minors for being in possession of alcohol. There was about 20 times we cited the store. That was hampered a lot by a lot of things, mainly because the licensee didn't tell us the truth. Imagine that. And so they had my attention, let me just say. They had been in for multiple disciplinary conferences, things of that nature. So culminating, they went so far as they were covering their windows, so we couldn't do any kind of observation and into there to see what they were doing, and it was purposeful. They would refuse to take it down. So obviously I was pretty frustrated by this particular licensee. So this is how their past history culminated. So that's all on ATC, right? That's all us doing it. In January of this year, a 19-year-old minor driving the wrong way on the roadway, hits another vehicle, kills himself, kills kills the driver and the front seat passenger, and kills a 10-year-old, seriously injures, let me think, it was 6, 3, and 2, I think, in that car. Major problem, right? We don't make that tie, right? We expect, we have to rely on other agencies to tie that back to us. I heard about the wreck, but that's all I know. I don't know that it's a DWI. That there was drinking involved. I don't know anything except just the basics at that point. And luckily, that trooper that worked it immediately thought, these families deserve me to do the best I can in this investigation. Both my driver's dead, but what he observed, and this is what he observed at the scene, that this 19-year-old minor had a bottle of open alcohol between his legs, partially consumed. And that, again, kudos to this trooper. He did all the work. Family it cooperated. He found out where that alcohol was purchased. Ultimately contacted us a few days later, which is key because now we hopefully can get some things. Had to get warrants, of course, but ultimately, because our licensee kept lying, saying that his surveillance video system didn't record, which we had to get warrants and it did. Ultimately, they sold to this minor multiple times before, but twice on the day of the accident. One of them being one of the owners. And so this is why I say it's so imperative to work together with other agencies. We would not have known anything about this as an agency. Nothing. So the great news is we were able to get onto this fast. Generally, when they appeal, which this particular licensee appealed everything we ever gave them for discipline. Fortunately, we really fought back, and generally the commission will stay any kind of discipline. In this case, we really fought back and gave them the history. They chose not to stay the discipline. The fortunate thing is their license was revoked by us. Fortunately for us, they have taken that because they sold their store and now they've moved to Texas. So that could be Texas's problem now, because I think they've also had a store on the East Coast at one point. So, but my point of that is at least I know that connection, and it wasn't necessarily a to-go, by definition drink, but the original package, this kid was caught on camera opening it as he walked outside the store, taking a big drink before he ever got in his car. So, just as an example for us that we do rely on other agencies for that assistance. And in this case, it was so dramatic. I mean, when I mentioned the prevention groups, they've reached out and, expressed their support and that kind of thing. So it was a pretty big deal. It's been a pretty big deal for all of us in Missouri, and our local prosecutors are going after them on a criminal basis as well.
That's great, Dottie. That's great, Dottie. So I think we're kind of at the end of our time here. Just a really quick question. Pam Erickson asked about drunk drivers in Las Vegas and what can be done in terms of traffic calming and also vehicle technologies. And I'll take that one just really quickly. In the infrastructure law, which just passed the mega piece of congressional legislation, federal legislation funding DOT and other agencies, but mainly DOT. There are some provisions in there that are going to require NHTSA to do some rulemakings in the future around some emerging technologies, things like drunk driving detection, distracted driving detection, and also an update to the new car assessment program, which is how we buy cars in the U.S., the safety ratings. So I think there are some emerging things in that legislation, Pam, but it might be a little bit before those come to fruition. I had some other questions too, but unfortunately we are hitting the hour, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. This has been a great panel. I think we could talk for another hour easily because these are big issues and they're important issues. But I do want to turn it back over to Kelly to give us a few key takeaways from today's discussion.
Great, thanks, JT. And I noticed in Pam's question, she said that her card can apparently go up to 160, although she hasn't tested it. So I think we'll have to take her word for that. And I hope that is the case. I hope the governor kicks in before that. So as mentioned, I want to leave us with 3 key takeaways. And I think Jerry really summarized this well, that law enforcement, both traditional and alcohol law enforcement, is, to quote Jerry, overtasked, overassigned, and underfunded, and is under tremendous pressure in the wake of ongoing budget shortcomings, social issues, and COVID. So that's number 1. Number 2, state and local enforcement budgets, as we said, have been severely impacted, causing big shifts in how law enforcement, or how enforcement at large occurs, impacting both traffic safety and the enforcement of alcohol laws. And lastly, a point that changing alcohol laws maybe need to be approached in a thoughtful manner, considering those far-reaching impacts and various stakeholders, including public health. When it comes to alcohol to-go laws, maybe they shouldn't have been rubber stamped. I think so. Every other year, the center conducts a national alcohol regulation sentiment survey. Say that one 5 times fast. But this past year in 2021, we saw that Americans want to see legislators go slow before they make things permanent. And certainly the cat might be out of the barn, or however the phrase may be, cat or horse, whatever they are. But I think there are ramifications to consider here. And as we're seeing from Dottie's conversations and the things that Matt has brought to us as well, maybe we need to take a look at these and look at the implications and impact. And Dottie said, communicate with each other across agencies and with prevention folks as well. But as mentioned, we want to be respectful of everyone's time, and want to thank you all who have joined us here on the panel for your thoughtful insights, and all of you who took time today to join the webinar. We've recorded it, so we'll be sure to post it on our website and on YouTube in the coming week or so. And then one last item I'd like to mention is that the center is hosting our 15th annual Alcohol Law and Policy Conference in Nashville later this month. We would love for you to join us. I've added that information as well as the national survey to the chat here, so snag that quickly before we wrap up. And please don't hesitate to reach out to any one of us with any questions. I need to go check on a cat that just got let out of a barn somewhere. So I thank you all so much for joining. Have a wonderful rest of your week.